When I was 12 years old, my family moved into an old farmhouse in Posey County. The house was large, as if it captured time itself within its old walls and creaky wooden floors that made soft sounds with every step. The house had an aura of grandeur despite its simplicity, a spacious bedroom on the ground floor where my mom and her husband slept, separated from the dining room by a long hallway. This hallway was wide enough to serve as a bedroom for my little brother. Upstairs, there were 3 other bedrooms and a large hallway, but 2 of the rooms were off limits, filled with personal belongings belonging to the landlord's late mother. The 3rd room was left for me, while my older brother took over the hallway, which was about the size of a small bedroom. Although I was used to sleeping alone, I didn't feel comfortable staying in my room at night. I couldn't explain why. It was just an unsettling feeling, though I tried to sleep there for a while. About a month after we moved in, one morning, my mom came in to wake me up. I was lying on my side, my back facing the door. Before she could say anything, I jumped up, screaming, which startled her as much as it startled me. I tried to calm her down, saying she just scared me, but I didn't tell her the real reason. It was a strange feeling, as if something had happened to me that night, but I had been forced to forget it somehow. I always described it like a scene from the Superman movie, where Superman takes Lois Lane and shows her everything about himself, then kisses her to make her forget. I'm not saying Superman kissed me, of course, but that was the closest explanation I could find. After that incident, I started sleeping downstairs in the living room. A few days later, my older brother decided he wanted my room, so we switched. He took my bed, while I took his bunk bed. I slept on the bottom bunk, and used the top for storage. The first 2 nights passed peacefully, but on the 3rd night, I woke up in the middle of the night with an odd feeling. It felt like someone or something was watching me sleep. I slowly turned over and opened my eyes to see the silhouette of a very tall man standing by my bed. He was unnaturally tall, and as soon as I looked at him, he moved toward one of the closed rooms that held the landlord's mother's belongings. He was as tall as the bunk bed itself, an old wooden bed that was much taller than modern bunk beds, probably around 8 feet. I felt a terror unlike anything I'd known. I grabbed my pillow and blanket and ran downstairs to sleep in the living room. From that day on, I never dared to sleep upstairs again, and my brother soon joined me, sleeping in the living room with me every night. As time passed, more strange things began happening. One night, I woke up to the sound of small footsteps running through the house. I looked over at the TV, and there was a blond boy, around 5 years old, rummaging through our VCR tapes. He looked at me with innocent eyes, but I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move. Instead, I covered my head until morning light came. Remember, I was only 12. A few days later, I decided to talk to my mom. In a low voice, I asked if she'd seen anything unusual in the house. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at me with hesitation and then finally admitted that she had seen things, too. She told me she often saw an old woman standing in one of the doorways, looking outside as if waiting for something. The house had several old doors leading outside from different rooms, maybe for ventilation purposes. There was a door on the back porch leading to the kitchen, another to the hallway that my little brother used as a bedroom, one in the dining room, one in the downstairs bedroom, and one in the living room. My mom described the woman as short, about 5 feet tall, wearing a long dress and an apron, with her hair styled in a neat bun. From her appearance, she seemed like she was from the early 1900s. We lived in that house for over 2 years, and despite everything we experienced, nothing ever seemed to mean us harm. We thought that maybe the old woman was the landlord's mother, but we never found out who the little boy or the tall man might have been. In 2003, I began my college journey, filled with ambition but weighed down by the sorrow of losing my father just 2 weeks before I left home. I moved away from my small hometown, where the population barely reached 1,000, and headed to Des Moines, a big, bustling city, alive with lights and crowds, that felt like a whole new world to me. My college was small and private, with around 3,000 students. I took my first steps in this new life with optimism and enthusiasm, trying to find my place among the masses. A few weeks into the semester, some friends and I decided to go out for a walk, and on our way back to the dorm, we were suddenly ambushed by a group of strangers who began throwing bricks at us. It was terrifying and completely unexpected. One of my friends was hit directly in the eye, suffering a serious injury that ultimately caused him to lose his eye and transfer to another university. I couldn't fully process what had happened, and it made me question the safety of this new life I had stepped into. After that incident, the police increased their patrols around campus, but I never felt as safe as I had before. With the added emotional stress, I found it difficult to focus on my studies, especially after my father's death, which had left a deep void in my life. I started sleeping all day and escaping to fraternity parties at night, trying to numb my grief temporarily. I became friends with a gay guy, the first openly gay person I had ever met, and he became my party companion. We danced the nights away, forgetting our troubles for a little while. But I was truly lost, and my condition continued to deteriorate. At one of the after parties, I had already been drinking heavily and was barely aware of my surroundings. At that moment, a guy named Joe, whom I had spoken to a few times online, approached me. He convinced me that he was a friend I could trust. Taking advantage of my state, he led me to a secluded room, and although I tried to resist, I was too weak. I eventually blacked out. When I came to, I found myself alone, and Joe was gone. I felt ashamed and shattered, unable to tell anyone what had happened. The grief of losing my father was still weighing on me, and now it was compounded by feelings of betrayal and vulnerability. Instead of seeking help, I withdrew into myself, skipping classes and sinking further into a cycle of self-destructive partying. I wish I had known back then that there were people who could help, people who would listen and understand my pain. I wish I had known that I could have requested to delay the semester and taken some time to recover from my sorrow. So, my message to anyone going through difficult times is this: don't stay alone in your pain. Reach out for help. Talk to a counselor, a doctor, or even a trusted friend, because you deserve support, and you deserve a better life. When I think of my childhood, a vivid picture of an old house in Lawrence, Kansas comes to mind, a house where imagination intertwines with reality, a house filled with endless stories. This was the first home my grandfather bought to establish his large family. Everything in it, from the polished wooden stairs to the living and dining rooms, was original to the purchase. As the family grew, so did the house, with my grandfather eventually building a garage, an additional living room, and a master bedroom complete with a bathroom after my birth. Over time, the house was passed down to my father, who decided to buy it from my grandfather to start his new life with his family. My family always had strange stories about this house, but I have personal experiences I want to share, experiences I witnessed at a young age, so most of what I'll recount now comes from my mother's memory. My father traveled a lot for work, which meant my mother spent much of her time alone in the house with her children, me, my older brother, and my younger brother. There were nights when I would run to my mother, telling her that a ghost was playing with my toys, those toys filled with buttons that made cheerful sounds and flashed lights. My mother would go upstairs to my room and find several toys going off all at once. She didn't know how to react, other than to firmly say, "Knock it off, you're scaring the kids." It seemed like her words were a spell, as everything would stop immediately. The ghost, whom my family referred to as John, seemed to be more curious than malicious. He would hide shoes, change TV channels, and even turn the television off while we were watching, in addition to playing with our blinking toys. Over time, we got cats, and we would watch them stare up the stairs as if they were looking at something invisible. One cat even hissed at something that appeared to be nothing at all. In another incident, my mother swatted me on the butt for something I had done, and suddenly a vase shot across the room. My mother described it not just as being knocked over but as if it had launched across the space and smashed against the opposite wall. She probably thought about that every time she considered disciplining me again. Years passed, and after I moved out of my parents' house, I lived with my boyfriend, who is now my husband, along with his best friend and his girlfriend, who is now his wife. We rented a house in Kansas City, Kansas, with separate living spaces. The best friend and girlfriend, whom I will now refer to as the roommates, lived upstairs, while my husband and I were downstairs, each with our own bathroom and kitchen. Despite not being able to place it, we all had a strange feeling about the house. Some of us attributed it to the neighborhood we lived in, while others felt it was something else entirely. One night, while my husband and I were watching a movie, I saw what looked like the shadow of a person walking in front of our floor lamp behind the TV. My eyes shot over to it as soon as I saw it, and while I didn't see anyone, I could see the lamp slowly swaying back and forth, as if someone had just bumped into it. It was a heavy lamp with a marble base, and it wouldn't move easily unless it was touched. I asked my husband if he had seen it, but since we had just started listening to scary stories, he thought I was messing with him. But sure enough, he could also see the lamp slightly swaying back and forth until it came to a complete stop. We never saw anything else in that house, but our roommates did on 2 separate occasions. They talked about how they saw a blue orb floating in the middle of their bedroom in the dead of night. They both saw it at least on one of those occasions. My grandparents were a significant part of my life as I grew up. My family made it a point to visit them every weekend, and I spent many summers with my grandmother while my parents were at work. However, during my college years, my grandmother developed Alzheimer's disease and began to decline in both her memory and health. I returned home after graduating, only to find that my grandmother no longer recognized any of our family members. She passed away in January 2009 and was cremated. My father had the small cardboard box that she was returned to us and professionally wrapped, as she was to be eventually buried next to my grandfather. It may seem a bit odd, but I know it meant a lot to him to have her resting place dressed up a bit before she was buried. While it may hold no importance, the timing of her remains being brought into the house and the sudden onset of strange occurrences in our family's home seemed to coincide. The occurrences began with footsteps, nothing out of the ordinary for us. We had a large entranceway with wooden stairs leading up to the bedrooms, so hearing people coming up and down the stairs at all hours of the night wasn't uncommon. It wasn't until one morning at breakfast when everyone had settled down to eat that my father asked who kept going up and down the stairs the previous night. None of us had been out of bed, and we all assumed it was just someone else. Fast forward a few months, and I had moved into the newly remodeled basement. I had mostly forgotten about the sounds on the stairs and was enjoying having my own space. The basement was like my little apartment, with a sitting area, bathroom, and small kitchen, a broke college kid's dream. My room in the basement was dark. There was only one window in the sitting area, so once the door to the bedroom was closed, it was like being in a sensory deprivation chamber. Without the digital alarm clock on my nightstand, it would have been impossible to know what time of day it was. I kept all the lights off because I enjoyed being in total darkness when I slept, which allowed my mind to wander to all the little things on the shelves I could fiddle with instead of sleeping. There was nothing memorable about the day leading up to this. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I'm sure I had been up playing video games or out with friends. I climbed into bed and curled up under the blankets, giving one last look at the room before I turned off the light. I woke up suddenly and reached over to hit the snooze button on my clock to see the time. I've never had trouble sleeping through the night, so I was a bit surprised to see 3 a.m. glowing on the display. What struck me as odd was that I had woken up exactly on the hour. I rolled over and wondered why I would have woken up when I began to notice sounds coming from upstairs. I sat up and strained to make out what I was hearing. It sounded like whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. I assumed my mother had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on, as she was prone to do. I considered for a moment getting up and turning it all off when the whispers got louder. I still couldn't make out the words, just whispers, almost as if they were coming through with static. The noise sounded like it was dropping down through the ceiling, and just outside the door to my bedroom. I was starting to get nervous, not knowing who would be coming down into the basement in the early morning. The whispering moved closer to the door as I sat up a bit more and gingerly said, "Mom?" The moment the word left my lips, something answered me back. "That's not Mom." A wave of fear washed over me as the sound moved into the room. I could see nothing in the darkness, but the sound was approaching along the narrow gap between my bed and the wall. The sound was directly above my head when something sat down just inches away from where I was laying. The mattress flexed, and my body slid forward into the space where someone should have been sitting. I was wide awake now, eyes fully open and breathing fast. I could feel my heart racing. None of this made sense. Then, suddenly, as quickly as it started, it was over. My bed popped back into shape, the noise stopped, and I was left frozen in fear and hyperventilating. I had no idea what had just happened. I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. That was the last thing that happened to me in that house. My sister had a few episodes of what we assume is sleep paralysis, but nothing else quite like what happened to me that night. It sparked an interest in me, but after having a few of these experiences, I think I've had enough for a lifetime. When I was 12 years old, an age filled with imagination and bravado, I decided to walk home after visiting the local community center. It was late, and the sky was overcast, making the night darker than usual. Back then, most people didn't have smartphones, so I didn't carry a flashlight. I took a shortcut down a dirt road that veered away from the highway, thinking it would get me home faster. Tall trees surrounded me on both sides, creating a haunting atmosphere as I walked alone, much like the protagonists in those eerie tales. Each step ignited mixed feelings of anxiety and courage within me. I moved cautiously, listening intently to every rustle and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard a faint sound that resembled sobbing. I wasn't the bravest kid, but at that age, I wanted to impress everyone, especially the girls. The sound was distinctly female, and it seemed to call me deeper into the woods. I followed the sound, trying to make enough noise to avoid startling whoever was there. As I entered a small clearing, the sound grew louder. The darkness still concealed most of my surroundings, but then I felt an unexpected force tackle me to the ground. I heard a female voice hiss in my ear, pleading for me to make it stop. Hands wrapped around my throat as the sobbing continued. I struggled against her grip, but I was just a small kid, and she was stronger. In a moment of desperation, I reached for anything I could find. My fingers closed around a loose branch, and I jabbed it toward what I assumed was my attacker's head, rewarded with a screech that sent a wave of panic through me. The weight lifted off me, and I rolled quickly to my feet and began to run. But my legs were short, and it was only a few steps before a hand clawed at my wrist, dragging me back down to the ground. That's when I finally saw her. The cloud cover had shifted just enough for me to make out her features. She was a tall woman with lanky, dirty blonde hair, and she appeared to be in the second trimester of pregnancy. Her expression was unsettling, a blend of pain and an eerie grin. I expected her grip around my throat to tighten again, but instead, the sobbing started up once more, accompanied by her plea to make it stop. I wriggled out from under her and began to crawl backward, but she paid me no mind. I turned and ran, the sound of her sobbing seeming to follow me like a haunting echo. Eventually, I made it back home, breathless and terrified, and I rushed to tell my mother about the encounter. She was skeptical, of course. It was late, and I was covered in mud and leaves, so she assumed I was trying to excuse some mischief. I was promptly sent to bed. The next morning, however, when the bruises on my neck became visible, she had no choice but to believe me. She called the sheriff, and I led them to the place where I thought I had seen the woman, but there was nothing there. I never heard anything more about her, where she had come from or what she wanted me to stop. Yet I still think about her often, and I avoid going into the woods whenever I can. The story begins in Maine, where the sky sparkled with spring colors, and the sweet scent of baked goods wafted through the air as children's laughter filled the atmosphere. It was May 1st, 2005, and I was only 4 years old, enjoying the annual May Day festival held at our local high school. It was a small but lively festival, featuring a bounce house, treats, face painting, fire safety demonstrations, and even one paramedic just in case anything unexpected happened. That year, a special clown entertained the children by making balloon animals. I was fascinated as I watched how colorful shapes transformed into giraffes, horses, and other creatures. I looked up at my father and asked him innocently, "What will you get me, Daddy?" He smiled, glanced at the clown, and said, "Why don't you wait here for a moment? Let me grab us some water, and we can go together." But I couldn't wait. I was small and naive, so my little legs carried me toward the clown. He stood about 5 feet 11 inches tall and was scrawny, dressed in clothes splattered with paint, with a red foam nose and a huge smile painted on his face. His eyes were shadowed under poorly applied blue paint, and his long hair hung down the sides of his head, leaving a bald spot on top. I thought that was how clowns looked. When it was my turn, I stepped forward shyly, hesitating to interrupt his work. After he finished making a giraffe for the boy in front of me, I gathered my courage and stammered, "Excuse me, sir." But suddenly, his attention snapped to me, and his gaze felt piercing, as if he was looking directly into my soul. I could see nothing but his black pupils. Before I could ask for anything, he lunged forward with lightning speed, grabbing my left wrist and yanking it toward him. I felt panic surge through me as he sank his teeth into my forearm. My scream pierced the air, and in an instant, he released me and darted off through the back exits of the high school. I found myself on the ground, my arm bleeding, as my father rushed to my side, a look of anger and concern on his face. I realized I was in excruciating pain, and had no idea how to explain what had just happened. He glanced in the direction where the man had fled, and without hesitation, he picked me up and ran toward the paramedic's tent. In the midst of panic and confusion, a crowd of people gathered around us, all wanting to know what had transpired. In a small town like mine, no one could remain uninvolved. The police were called, and everyone listened intently to my account, their expressions filled with concern. After the paramedics treated me, they asked my father about the clown, and I told them I couldn't describe him accurately, but I knew I felt fear. The paramedics were shocked by my story, and I suddenly realized how serious the situation was. After a while, the event coordinators approached my father after my mother took me home. They informed him that they had never hired a clown for entertainment, and the man who fled was not part of the event. The police never found any trace of him, adding to the mystery. As time passed, my father mentioned that the event coordinators speculated the clown might have been a drug addict or someone under the influence, which was particularly painful to consider given the drug epidemic in our town. Ironically, my mother later sent me to clown school when I was in middle school and even started an animal-free circus made entirely of puppets. It seems that this strange experience left a deep mark on me, leading me to feel that I now have clown DNA. Years went by, and this story remained etched in my memory, always reminding me of that moment when a fun-filled day turned into a nightmare. That experience made me feel anxious whenever I saw a clown, instilling a sense of caution in situations that might appear harmless. In the end, all I wanted was a moment of joy, but life sometimes hands you the unexpected. In 2008, I was living in our family home with my 3 children. We had been in this house for about 7 years, and we hadn't experienced any issues until that time. My husband, who later became my ex, worked the night shift for the local railroad, which often left me home alone with the kids. I struggled with insomnia, so I would often spend my nights playing games online or chatting in different rooms after the children went to bed. I usually took my showers between 2 and 3 a.m. when the house was quiet and the busyness had subsided. Let me describe the bathroom a bit to help you visualize the scene, When you walked into the bathroom, the bathtub was on the left, and the sink was directly across from it. There was a wall that separated them where the toilet was located, giving the bathroom a snug but not uncomfortable feel. One night, while I was in the shower, I noticed the shower curtain moving strangely as if someone had opened the door. I felt a shadow pass by me, so I called out my son's name, thinking it was him. But I received no reply. When I peeked around the corner of the shower curtain, there was no one there. The door was closed, and our window was also shut because it was winter. I felt a surge of unease but told myself that perhaps I was just tired and imagining things. I went to bed and told my husband about it in the morning, but he thought I was just fatigued. I resumed my daily routine as a mother and wife, but the following night, the same thing happened again. The shower curtain moved, and a shadow passed by me once more. I couldn't believe I was imagining it for 2 consecutive nights. This bizarre occurrence repeated itself for about 2 weeks. At the same time, strange things were happening in my younger children's rooms as well. Their toys would be scattered around in the morning. We always cleaned their rooms before bedtime, so I assumed one of them was getting up at night and pulling out the toys. However, when I asked them in the morning, both denied it. What was even more unsettling was that my 8-year-old daughter told me she felt like her stuffed toys and Beanie Babies were hitting her at night, and asked if I had been throwing them at her. I assured her I hadn't done anything of the sort. One day, my 15-year-old son asked me, when I returned from the market, when we had gotten a cat. I told him we didn't have one, but he informed me that he had seen a black and white cat walk through the hallway into my husband's room. I started to worry and searched the house thoroughly to ensure a cat hadn't somehow gotten inside, but there was no evidence of one. By that point, I had had quite enough of the creepy shower stalker, the messy rooms, and now a ghost cat. 4 people couldn't all be experiencing a meltdown at the same time. I never told the kids about my experiences while showering. Instead, I went to a local store, bought salt and sage, and performed a cleansing ritual for the house. After the cleansing, things slowly began to return to normal. But then I found out a few months later that my youngest son, who would have been 10 at the time, had also seen the shower curtain blow, and the shadow of someone passing by. He said he had called out our names, but no one answered. My oldest son had also seen the cat a few times. As far as we knew, there had been no deaths in the house. It had previously belonged to my husband's grandmother before she passed away in the ICU. Even to this day, I can't figure out what happened. I was never a big believer in ghosts or spirits, but I can't think of anything else that could have caused such eerie chaos. The only one in our family of 5 who didn't experience anything was my husband, but he was only home overnight once or twice a week and would sleep during the day. Years have passed, and we've had some other paranormal experiences since then, but I'll save those for another time. These events still evoke questions and remain a mysterious part of our lives. When I was a teenager, my family lived in a small town near Boston, not far from Salem, Massachusetts. This place where I lived wasn't just an ordinary location, it was steeped in rich history. The infamous witch trials weren't confined to Salem. The hysteria spread throughout the region. While the historical research is lacking in depth, it was known that the situation in our town was particularly controversial. Our house stood across the street from the home of the pastor credited with igniting the religious fervor that led to the persecution of those accused of witchcraft. We lived on land that once belonged to the original town common, just a stone's throw from the cemetery where many of those involved in the witch hysteria were buried. You could say that the very ground we lived on resonated with echoes of those dark days. At the time of this event, I was 17 and passionate about competitive swimming. That year, our team had regular morning practices before school, and getting up early was often brutal, but I had grown accustomed to leaving the house at 4:15 a.m., before dawn broke. One day in late October or early November, I left the house at my usual time. As I turned to lock the front door and headed toward my car, I noticed an unusual movement in the driveway. I looked closer and saw a man approximately 8 to 10 meters away, walking slowly toward me. Most of his features were obscured by shadows, but I distinctly remembered his lean and lanky build. He seemed to be staring down at the ground in front of him, and he was dressed in dark navy blue or black clothing and leather boots. Our driveway was steep and narrow, lined with large wild shrubs and trees. The entrance was somewhat concealed from the road, especially in the dark. It was unlikely that anyone would walk up to our house unless they were doing so with intent. I can't recall the next few seconds, but suddenly, I found myself back inside, standing in my parents' room, waking my mom. She quickly grasped my panic and came with me to check things out. She turned on all the outside lights before opening the front door to look out. It felt as if everything unfolded in less than 30 seconds, though it was probably closer to a minute. As she inspected the area, I pointed out where I had seen him, at the spot where the shrubs ended, and the driveway widened into a parking area. When she asked if he had threatened me in any way, I realized he hadn't. His demeanor had been entirely calm and casual, almost too casual. His hands might have even been in his pockets. After a few minutes of searching, we didn't find anyone. Considering it safe enough, she stood watch while I got into my car. For several blocks, I jumped at every shadow that resembled a person, half expecting someone to leap out at me. After the sun rose, my mom looked for signs of a person, and I did the same. As I observed the dry, crunchy leaves along the driveway, I had a realization: the man hadn't made any sound. I couldn't understand how a living person, walking in boots as relaxed as he appeared to be, could move so silently across such a noisy ground cover. Moreover, how could he not have heard me shut the large, heavy wooden front door? Why didn't he react? Wouldn't a living person take that as a cue to hide? And if he meant me harm, why didn't he move faster or acknowledge my presence? I don't have strong beliefs about ghosts being trapped souls with unfinished business, but I do believe in the conservation of energy. It makes sense to me that places can hold on to the energy of events that happen there, both good and bad. Given the strong emotions and trauma associated with the persecution of those accused of witchcraft, I wondered if maybe the man I saw was a kind of memory. The soundless way he moved, coupled with his lack of reaction, left me contemplating this possibility. Was he someone whose wife or mother had been accused? Was he making accusations, or had he been accused himself? I may never know the true story about my early morning visitor, but I will always wonder about the nature of that visit and what lay behind it. This experience was not just a fleeting moment. It left a profound impression on me and sparked a desire to understand the history and the stories that this place carries. In southwest Michigan, where the shores of Lake Michigan bask under the sun, I spent my childhood in joyous summer days. I was incredibly lucky to have a close friend whose family owned private beach rights. We had wonderful summer memories, but some of those memories were tinged with a hint of fear. It was August 2009, a beautiful summer day. My two best friends and I were getting ready to enter our senior year of high school. That evening, we learned about a meteor shower that would peak that night, and we were thrilled to watch it. We spent the day swimming in the lake and soaking up the sun until night fell. As the sun set and the stars appeared, we settled on the beach to watch the celestial display. It was our first time witnessing a meteor shower, and it did not disappoint. The sky was filled with twinkling stars, and meteors streaked across the sky like shooting stars, making our hearts soar with joy. We sat together, enjoying the spectacle, and with every shooting star, we were reminded to make a wish. But suddenly, we began to notice something strange. One star was moving erratically, unlike anything we'd ever seen. It didn't travel like a plane or satellite. Instead, it darted in all directions at varying speeds. We joked that it was probably aliens enjoying the show too. Just as we were settling into our celestial excitement, Celeste, my friend's Australian shepherd, bolted toward the water, barking furiously. We felt a wave of concern wash over us and realized something was off. We called for Celeste, worried she might have found something disturbing in the water. but the usually obedient dog seemed oblivious to our voices, focused on something moving in the gentle waves. With the moon illuminating our surroundings, we had decent visibility. Moments later, something began to emerge from the surf and onto the shore. It was a creature about the size of a raccoon, silhouetted against the water. As it approached, I noticed its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It appeared slippery like a fish but was covered in either fur or feathers, making it hard to discern what it actually was. All we knew was that Celeste was not pleased with this uninvited guest. As we tried to comprehend what we were witnessing, the creature stood on its wobbly legs and scuttled quickly onto the beach. Celeste had clearly had enough and darted away. Without thinking, the three of us took off after her, realizing we needed to climb a decent-sized sand dune to get back to my friend's house. Entering the woods to begin our ascent, we suddenly remembered that we had forgotten to grab flashlights before leaving the house. The trees were blocking the little light that remained, and we found ourselves surrounded by darkness. With a potentially creepy creature chasing us, we now had to navigate the old stairs and trails in the dark. And when I say stairs, I mean old railroad ties of varying sizes scattered about to help climb up the steep dune. For reasons unknown, we had a lighter and a few sparklers with us, so we decided to use the sparklers to light our path. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, and with every frantic flick of the lighter, the surrounding woods were faintly illuminated. I was terrified that with every spark, a horrific face might appear. Eventually, we managed to light a sparkler and cautiously made our way up. At the top of the dune, we still had about half a mile to walk down a desolate road to reach home. At this point, we hadn't seen or heard anything, which calmed us slightly. We chose to walk back rather than risk another panic by running. As we entered my friend's yard, a wave of relief washed over us. But just as the cosmos seemed to sense our relief, an incredibly loud crashing noise erupted from the woods. Any ounce of comfort was swiftly replaced by pure terror, and we scrambled into the house, desperate for safety. That night was filled with bizarre experiences, and we still wonder about what actually happened. It could have been a series of strange coincidences, or perhaps we really did see aliens floating around in the sky, frantically searching for their lost body. Maybe the little guy just needed our help, and we thought that running away while screaming was the better response. But ultimately, we will never know for sure. In the countryside of Minnesota, away from the hustle and bustle of the major cities, lies a spot steeped in legends and eerie tales known as Dead Man's Hill. This area, with a history dating back to before the Civil War, has been the scene of many mysterious and tragic events that have instilled fear and dread in the hearts of its residents and visitors alike. During that era, many areas in Minnesota were linked to the Underground Railroad, a secret network established to help slaves escape from the harsh southern states. While many of these slaves settled in the north, others were seeking to reach Canada. Although the northern states were considered free territories, the laws still allowed bounty hunters to pursue escapees and return them to their owners in the South, creating an atmosphere of fear and despair among the enslaved. The legend tells of a runaway slave who was captured in the area. This slave, who is said to have made it to Minnesota, was apprehended by a bounty hunter who had been promised a handsome reward. The slave was tied to a fence post on the farm, but on a dark night, he managed to pull the post from the ground and escape again. However, the bounty hunter awoke, and a bloody struggle ensued, culminating in the slave killing his captor with the man's own sword. When morning broke, the family living on the farm was shocked and horrified to find the slave's body near their front porch, mortally wounded after having crawled to the house, dragging the fence post behind him. The family followed the blood trail to the top of a nearby hill, where they discovered the body of the dead bounty hunter. The bounty hunter was buried at the top of what would come to be known as Dead Man's Hill, while the slave was buried next to the house under a tree planted to mark his grave. As time passed, two more men met untimely and unexplained deaths on Dead Man's Hill. One was a sharecropper living on a nearby farm, and the other was a man hired by the farmer's widow. Both men were attacked and killed on the hill by an unknown assailant, leaving a trail of footprints in the snow that suggested the attacker had been dragging something behind him, possibly the size of a fence post. The deaths were attributed to the ghost of the runaway slave, said to haunt the farmhouse where he had died. Strange occurrences became commonplace in the house, with items often disappearing only to reappear later. Residents reported hearing ghostly sounds on a nightly basis, typically beginning near the hill and continuing up to the house, a moaning and dragging sound mixed with the clinking of chains. The ghost was never seen, only heard, and his presence loomed ominously for many years. It was said that bizarre things happened in the vicinity of the hill, but fortunately, no one else had met their end in that place, leaving some to wonder if the other two men who died had any connection to the slaves' capture. Wilmar, Minnesota, is located in the south-central part of the state, and the farm where Dead Man's Hill is situated is private property just outside of town. As such, the area remains shrouded in mystery, echoing with the tales of the past and the lingering spirit of a tragic history that refuses to be forgotten. I was fairly new to the state of Mississippi, having just moved there in January 2024. During this time, my husband and I bought a piece of land that had an old brick house, which was in poor condition and needed a lot of indoor rehabilitation. My husband wasn't often home, as he drives a semi-truck all over the country, but despite his absence, our marriage was happy and healthy. At that time, I didn't know anyone locally, but I had two lovely cats to keep me company. While they couldn't talk, their presence was enough to create a sense of warmth in our home. Our house was built in the 1970s, not too old but also not new. Most of our land was covered in thick woods, and everything was so overgrown that it was nearly impossible to navigate without a machete or chainsaw. Because of this, I decided to take it upon myself to start clearing away some of the thick brush one day. I was hacking a trail through the trees, and I had ventured deep enough in that I needed to turn on my headlamp, which made it impossible to see the house in the darkness of the trees. At that moment, I tripped over a tree root and fell on my hand, causing a surge of pain to course through me. I was relatively certain that I had snapped my wrist, so I scooted against the base of a tree to rest for a minute before trying to get up. Just after I managed to get myself upright, I was assaulted by a ghastly smell the likes of which I had never encountered before. With that sudden stench came the sharp sound of a tree limb snapping, which was deafening in the silence of the woods. I knew there were plenty of animals out here, but I couldn't think of anything that would smell that bad unless it was already dead. And I was sure that dead animals don't snap tree limbs. The next thing I knew, a tree not too far away fell over. It wasn't a big one, but it definitely would have hurt had I kept going forward. I silently thanked the universe for my stumble, realizing that I was a good mile from anyone who could actually hear me. I laid my head back against the tree and sighed heavily, trying to motivate myself to rise with one good hand. Being a bigger girl and not the most athletic, I usually needed both hands to lift myself off the ground. As I was trying to get up, I heard what I thought was thunder, which made the trees rattle. It rained all the time down here, and I was sure it was just a pop-up storm. But after a brief moment of silence, I heard a roar that was so primal and terrifying it shocked me to my core. Without missing a beat, after the roar subsided, I heard a loud thud as a large rock smashed into a tree near me. It was at that moment that the urgency to leave hit me like a brick in the face. I jumped up with the agility of a gymnast and jogged my way back on the trail, fearing that whatever had made the noise would be chasing after me or, worse, that I would receive a large rock straight to the back. Thankfully, none of those things happened. Once I reached the tree line, I was genuinely surprised to be met by a warm, sunny day with no sign of a storm at all. This confirmed in my mind that something was unhappy with my presence in its territory. I had heard tales of men living in the woods, rumors of dog men, goat men, and Sasquatch. All I know is that I will be bringing more than a machete on my next trek through the woods, whenever that may be. Perhaps next time, I will be better prepared to face whatever might be lurking in the shadows of the trees.